www.thehopeappeal.com.
IT Business Solutions, Axia Computer Systems. Our services range from networking security, web design and support, hardware procurement, software development, internet services, design and planning. Contact us today on 01923 333 111 or visit our website. Axia, your local IT business solutions.
Al-Kauthar is a humanitarian project for hundreds of widows and orphan children in Iraq. For just £30 per month, an orphan will be provided with a monthly allowance of food, clothing, education, as well as other basic necessities. Donate now. Together we can make them smile again.
For over 10 years, we have strived to provide better access to water for many water-scarce communities. Water connects every aspect of life. Access to safe water and sanitation can quickly turn problems into potential, unlocking education, work opportunities, and improved health for women, children, and families across the world. Help us give vulnerable communities life-changing access to clean and safe water. Donate today to our Aliaska Water Appeal and help provide clean and safe water to families across the world.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. All praises to Allah, the Creator of the universe and its Sustainer, the Provider of believers and non-believers. And may His choicest blessings be on the seal of His prophets, the last of His messengers and His holy progeny, and in particular on this day of remembrance. May His incessant blessings ever continue on that illustrious grandson of the Holy Prophet, on Imam Hussain, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have arrived at the end of our journey together, looking at the mental health lessons from the history of Karbala. It is fitting that we, of course, conclude this discussion on the day of Ashura, on the day of the sacrifice of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and his companions and his friends. And we pay special tribute to the ladies of the camp of Imam Hussain, and particularly Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam, whose ambassadorial leadership ensured that we received the lessons from Karbala today. And Yazid failed in his attempt to bury the history of Karbala under the sands of Karbala. We have been reflecting upon approximately 10 different dimensions of mental health lessons from the history of Imam Hussain alayhi salam's speeches, letters, actions, as well as those of his family members and companions. And in looking at 5 dimensions of self-knowledge and 5 dimensions of resilience, we have found a number of connections with the scientific literature on psychotherapy and effective forms of addressing mental health challenges, particularly anxiety, depression, and other conditions for which psychotherapy is offered. The last of our discussions today, I'd like to shift gear and reflect upon what Imam Hussain was really teaching in those final hours of his life. That it is possible to move beyond simply coping with the challenges of our lives. It is possible to move beyond resilience and determination and ordinary hope and optimism, all of which are important for our well-being. But he showed us there is another level that we can strive to, a level that he demonstrated mastery in. And that's a dimension of human activity, of human ambition, that is increasingly the subject of scientific study, which is flourishing. The subject of our discussion today is the ways in which the Imam alayhi salam and Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam taught how to move beyond ordinary resilience and actually flourish even in the midst of the most unspeakable tragedies. To remain so rooted to that which inspires us that actually we reach a new dimension of our psychology, a new dimension of spiritual awareness, so that even though the events of our lives may be unspeakably tragic, we nevertheless remain enraptured and entirely absorbed in that which inspires us. The dhikr of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was such that he was in a continual state of dhikr throughout that day. So even though from the morning of Ashura to the late afternoon, he was collecting the bodies of his companions and then family members, his connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remained undeterred, unchanged. And we saw in the late afternoon how he was able to reach a level that people had never seen before, a level of spiritual radiance, a level of physical effectiveness, a level of oratory. Whichever dimension of activity one looks at, he had reached a new state, a spiritual state that was manifesting physically. But before we look at the history of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, I think given what he said about the importance of the work of Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam, it is fitting that we begin this last session together by first looking at the example of Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam. For when we want to look at the history of flourishing, particularly from the history of Karbala, one of the most inspiring examples is from Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam. This is an event that has received a huge amount of attention and scholarly attention, not just from historians, but also from mystics, for it shows a level of spiritual perspective that defies ordinary analysis. After the tragedy of Karbala occurred, the ladies and the children were taken, the family members were taken to Kufa, to the court of the accursed Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. And there he tried to humiliate the family. He tried to denigrate what the Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam stood for, who they were, their spiritual status. And he said to Bibi Zaynab, what did you make? He tried to taunt her by saying, what did you make of what Allah did to your family in Karbala? Now, let's bear in mind, this was a lady who had 72 scars upon her heart, including 2 of her own beloved sons, Own and Muhammad, who had been martyred on the day of Ashura. an ordinary person would have been dejected, at least, grief-stricken, broken by the sheer colossal weight of the calamity that had befallen her. But she didn't just show how to be resilient in those times. She went way beyond that. She went to a level at which she was flourishing spiritually and manifesting that spiritual flourishment in oratory, in a physical presence that was inspiring to the people in the court, such that Ubaydullah became intimidated himself, even though he was supposed to be the vanquishing governor. But actually, he was the one who was intimidated by the response of his prisoner. What a response it must have been. It was a very short response, but it was a response that has been woven into the tapestries of irfan, into the tapestries of Islamic mysticism and spiritual awareness, spiritual realization, spiritual attainment. Her words, of course, are well known to us in the community. She responds to Ubaydullah saying, "Ma ra'aytu," I did not see anything, "illa jamila." And these 4 short words of Arabic actually transform the entire conversation. Because in her response to Ubaydullah, who said, "What did you see in Karbala to what Allah did to your family?" she said, "I did not see anything other than Jamila." Now, Jamila is not just ordinary beauty. It's actually one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such that in all the pain and the affliction that she witnessed, in all the sacrifice that befell her, in all the blood and all the gruesomeness of battle, she saw but the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because then, she made clear that it was the destiny of the family of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his holy progeny, to stand firm and protect the teachings. For it was only through sacrifice that the teachings would have been protected. But this shift in perspective of ma ra'aytu, that I did not see anything, it's not that she didn't actually witness the events that took place on that day. She saw. But how she saw is what's at stake here. That she didn't see with just ordinary eyes and with an ordinary witnessing. No, quite the opposite. She saw through the eyes of inspired flourishing, of the unfolding of her soul, such that everything was viewed through the lens of divine beauty. And it shows us just a little glimpse of what it's like to be flying at that altitude of spiritual attainment. That even when faced with such incredible calamity after tragedy after calamity, she still remains at that lofty status to be able to respond in this way to Ubaydullah. And of course, he was stunned. And the court, there were murmurings around the gathered guests as to who is this person. And in that response, she was able to show who the Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam were. And therefore then she was able to give a powerful speech about the role of an imam and who Yazid was and who Ubaydullah was. And the extent to which they had deviated from the path of Islam, and she laid bare the extent of their hypocrisy. This is an example that is beyond resilience. It's an example of strength that is beyond ordinary courage. It is an example of what a human being can attain when they flourish through the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For despite her incredible eloquence, her presence of mind, and her strength. She was always humbly rooted to the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that also put her beyond the reach of Ubaydullah and Yazid and all the other despots. They could not reach her because she was at a spiritual level of flourishing that their words and their actions could not touch her. And yet, she was able to respond to them from her special lofty state. It's an example of what can be achieved through spiritual mastery. And we see this kind of flourishing from Imam Hussain alayhi salam throughout the day of Ashura. In the interest of time, I'd like to pick on 3 examples from him, so that we have a total of 4 examples of flourishing from that day from the history of Karbala. We just discussed Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam in Kufa, and we look at 3 from Imam Hussain alayhi salam on the day of Ashura on the plains of Karbala. I'd like to go towards the end of the day first, and then look at earlier parts of the day. After all the companions had been martyred, after the family members were martyred, Imam Hussain alayhi salam goes out to battle. And we will look at some of his speeches in a moment. But the point I want to make now is the observation of a third-party individual. Abdullah bin Ammar narrates that, by God, I have never seen such determination from a person who had lost his sons, his family, his followers. By Allah, I have never seen anyone like him. Such was the strength and the valor and the courage and the efficacy with which Imam Hussain alayhi salam was fighting, such that the rear ranks of the army of Yazid hit the walls of Kufa. That's how far they were scattered, like the sheep are scattered when the wolf enters the pack. This was the kind of military prowess he was able to show. This was the kind of valor of warriorship he was able to demonstrate. And Abdullah bin Ammar was just left stunned by what he saw. I mean, this was beyond flourishing in a military sense. This was a supernatural kind of strength being manifested, for an ordinary person would long have been broken by the calamities and the sacrifices of that day. Thirdly, so we look at the actual physical flourishing of Imam Hussain. Thirdly, we look at the oratory and the rhetorical flourishing of the Imam alayhi salam. How his speeches to the army of Yazid throughout the day were powerful, direct, and moving. As we discussed yesterday, that some in the army of Yazid who actually had a willingness to hear the truth, they crossed over. It is narrated that about 17 people from that side joined Imam Hussain because they were so struck by the power and truth of what he was saying. But that eloquence was not just at the beginning of the day. We see that that eloquence remained throughout the day. It was as though whatever they did to him, whatever they did to his family, they were not able to diminish him. There was no diminishing, despite all their unspeakable cruelty, despite all their cowardly besieging of the young fighters from the side of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Even after they had murdered the 6-month-old baby of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, Hazrat Ali Asghar, with a 3-pronged arrow, the Imam alayhi salam remained powerful and eloquent in his speech. He continued to flourish in his role as an imam, to speak the truth, and indeed to continue guiding people, even his enemies, right to the end. And this aspect of guidance is the fourth aspect of flourishing that I'd like to turn to. Because the Imam alayhi salam was able to show compassion even to his enemies. His nature flourished to such an extent that his inherent compassion was shining on the battlefield of Karbala. We will see an account later, towards the end of our discussion, from somebody who narrates what he saw from Imam Hussain alayhi salam's physical being in his final moments. But the compassion of the Imam alayhi salam was beyond the reach of these mercenaries. They were not able to dent his role as the representative of the Rahmatun lil Alameen, the representative of the one who came as a mercy upon the worlds, Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him and his holy progeny, of course. And we see the way the Imam alayhi salam spoke to slaves from the army of Yazid, who was sent to attack him. And rather than speaking to them harshly, he actually spoke to them with love and compassion. There is a narration of a man who was sent forward, an African slave who had been given a dagger to attack the Imam alayhi salam. And the Imam looks at him with loving compassion and he says, "You remind me so much of Bilal, that great companion of my grandfather Rasulullah. Tell me, do you have the same love of salah that he did?" The slave drops his dagger and screams. He said, "How can I attack a man of such luminous piety?" The love that the Imam alayhi salam showed was shining from him. It did not matter what the opposition did, because they were not able to touch it. It was not coming from a realm that they could access. He was flourishing at a spiritual realm. So their spears and their arrows, even though they wreaked evil upon the earth, were not able to even dent the completeness of the compassion of the Imam alayhi salam. He did not allow them to diminish him in any way, in any dimension. Not physically in terms of his warriorship, not in terms of his oratory. His speeches continued to be powerful, and not in his spiritual compassion either. He remained flourishing throughout the day. He remained perfect as an imam who was masoom, who was perfect, sinless, immaculate, regardless of the debauchery and the evil of the opposition. And this is a salient lesson for us, that as long as we hold firm to the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, to the teachings of the Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam, we too have the opportunity to flourish as who we are. We too have the opportunity to reach into a realm that is beyond ordinary strength, and to be extraordinary in our perspective, in our strength, in our compassion, in our service. That is the heritage. That ultimately is the destiny of an azadar of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. An azadar being somebody who remembers the sacrifices of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, weeps upon the tragedy, and seeks to implement the lessons of Karbala. As azadars, we also remember the powerful speeches he gave. Let us look in a little bit more depth at some of the oratory that he shared on that day. He calls out to some of the hypocrites who had written letters to him. It is narrated, he said, "O Shab'ath bin Rabi', O Hajar bin Abjar, O Qais bin Ash'ath." And he cited others. "Did you not write to me? The fruits have ripened, the fields are green with the harvest. And you will arrive in Kufa to an army that's ready for you." That these people were calling the Imam alayhi salam to go to them in Kufa so that he may preside over them as their Imam. The Imam is chiding them for being the hypocrites that they are. Did you not write to me? And now look, you're on the side of Yazid on this fateful day. It is narrated that Qais bin Ash'ath said, "O Hussain, why don't you pledge allegiance to Yazid and to your cousin," because they were an extended family, "and relieve yourself of this difficulty, and then you will be treated as you wish with respect and dignity." The Imam alayhi salam responded, "La wallah, no, never would I give an inferior hand to him." This notion of an inferior hand being the hand of subjugation, of surrender, of relinquishing your values and prostrating to the will of Yazid, and thereby allowing the teachings of Islam that his illustrious grandfather had brought, allowing those teachings of Islam to be completely lost, not just for that generation, but therefore to all generations to come as well. He said, "I shall never give an inferior hand, and I shall not evade them," the mercenaries of Yazid, "the way slaves evade." He said, "O servants of Allah, I have taken refuge in my Lord and your Lord against your stoning me to death." He's citing Quranic verses. And here he is making clear that actually he is beyond being intimidated by them. They no longer, assuming they ever did, which they didn't, have the power to intimidate him. He says, and in the citing Surah Al-Ghafir, Surah 40, verse 27, he says, "I seek refuge in the sanctum of my Lord and your Lord," reminding them, therefore, that there's accountability for them. "And I seek this protection from my Lord and your Lord in the inner sanctum of my Lord from every arrogant impostor who does not believe in the day of reckoning," to cite the holy verse. And by the way, Imam Hussain alayhi salam is once again citing Prophet Musa alayhi salam. So he is connecting his mission with the widest possible context of Tawheed, because that was the mission of Musa alayhi salam. And that's why Fir'aun wanted to murder him. The verse being, وَقَالَ Musa, and Musa said, "Inni uthtu bi Rabbi wa Rabbikum." Surely, indeed, I have sought refuge in my Lord and your Lord. Min kulli mutakabbirin, from every arrogant impostor. La yu'minu bi yawmil hisab, who does not believe in the day of accountability, the day of reckoning, the day of judgment. And in this way, he was able to address this individual, Qais bin Ash'ath, in the most powerful way possible. Not only putting him in his place, but also putting his own mission in its place, in its widest historical context, flourishing once again in his oratory, showing that he cannot possibly deviate from the path he is on, because his is the path for the salvation of the very message of Tawheed itself. The message of Musa alayhi salam. Hence he cites the same verse as Musa. And the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And of course, let us never forget that these mercenaries who had gathered to attack Imam Hussain alayhi salam were all the while pretending to be Muslims. Were all the while pretending to believe in the Quran. And yet, the Imam alayhi salam repeatedly showed to them how they were categorically in breach of the injunction of the Quran, and yet it made no difference to them whatsoever. It shows, therefore, just how hollow their claims to be Muslims were. It shows how transient the profession of faith was upon their lips. For as soon as they had professed faith, their actions showed the extent of their disbelief. And this is the power of the oratory of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, even after he had been subjected to so much bereavement and heartbreak. This is a level of human flourishing that humanity had not witnessed before. As the Imam alayhi salam went into battle, I want to cite to you his poetry. Of course, as was common in the Arab tradition at the time, that when a person went out into battle, they would recite a war poem, a rajas. And that was designed to have psychological effect upon both oneself as well as predominantly the enemy, by highlighting the lineage of oneself, the values and the creed for which one is fighting. And to make clear to everyone who you are and what you believe in and why you're going to battle and why you are confident that you will be successful. And we discussed at the beginning of our series intention and planning for success. But the Imam alayhi salam, when he goes out towards his final battles, he goes beyond just planning for success. He is flourishing at a level that he is now speaking to history. He's not just speaking to the individuals who are there. He says, and we write this on t-shirts, we write this in artwork, we teach our children this. He says, death is preferred to accepting humiliation. This was in relation to how he had been offered amnesty if he gave bay'ah. And bay'ah to Yazid was humiliation. He says, death is preferred to accepting humiliation, but humiliation is better than entering the fire. So he was chiding those people who had humiliated themselves by supporting Yazid. And he's warning them that actually much worse is to come for you, that the painful chastisement of the fire of hell is waiting for you. And then he introduces himself confidently. He says, I am Hussain, the son of Ali. So that if anyone there, did not know who he was, he had just removed that defense from them. The defense of ignorance was squarely removed, assuming it ever held at all. But now they had absolutely no leg to stand on. And he then also shows to them, as he's riding out in battle, that he's not afraid. That despite their number, they are not able to instill any fear in him. And that inability to make him afraid made them afraid. And this is a lesson for us in our lives. When we are facing a bully, if we show that we are not afraid of him or her, then that actually intimidates them. And of course, by citing his lineage as the son of Imam Ali alayhi salam, he was reminding them that he comes from the lineage of the greatest warriors. So they better prepare for battle. And of course, as we just discussed, he was able to scatter their ranks so that their rear files hit the walls of Kufa. That's the extent to which they had been scattered. And he continues, he says, I am Al-Hussain, the son of Ali. I swore never to succumb. That's the confident assertion of the values that he is fighting for. I swore never to succumb. I protect my father's descendants. I sacrifice my life in defending the religion of the Prophet. Now, for anyone who was independent there, it should have raised many questions about who the opposition actually was. Because remember, the political narrative at the time was that Yazid was going to conquer a rebel. That's how they had tried to frame the whole event. But the Imam al-Islam was able to cut through that lie quite clearly, so that history would record the truth of the matter. And we see this kind of rajas recorded in a whole range of sources. Of course, the Maqtal of Khawarizmi, the Maqtal of Bahrani, Muthir al-Ahzan from Ibn Nam al-Hilli. But we also see these speeches and the words of Imam Hussain recorded in Tabari's Tarikh, in Ibn Asakir, in Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat, as we were looking at yesterday. In all these Sunni texts, we see these clear words that to any independent scholar should be clear as day as to where the path of truth lay and where the path of falsehood lay. So the Imam al-Islam was not just speaking to the people of that time, he was speaking to all people of all time about what it means to take a stand for what is just. But it is not just the eloquence of his words as he was embarking upon the battle. It's also the power of his speech whilst he was fighting and the akhlaq with which he fought. For Al-Khawarizmi reports that as Imam Hussain al-Islam was cutting through the ranks of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, they wanted to try and exert psychological pressure on Imam Hussain al-Islam. So they began to rush towards his camp where his family was, where the ladies and the children were. The Imam al-Islam calls out. Now, imagine the context here. You've got a traditional medieval battle going on, which is noisy. You've got the stomping of hooves of horses. You've got the braying of horses. You've got the screaming of men being cut. You've got the clash of swords. It's a noisy, loud, large arena. And yet, when one man speaks, he speaks with such power that the entire battlefield falls silent and hears him. The Imam alayhi salam says, "O followers of the house of Abu Sufyan." What a powerful opening. Because by calling them the followers of the house of Abu Sufyan, he was making absolutely clear that they were kafir, that they were non-Muslim. Even though they claimed to be Muslim, they were actually siding with the one who did whatever he could to thwart the mission of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny. Abu Sufyan was the clear enemy of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so by calling these people, the mercenaries of Yazid, by calling them followers of the house of Abu Sufyan, he was able to identify them very clearly for history to come. And also showing them who they really are, lest they had any delusions of being Muslims. He says, if you do not have any faith whatsoever, and you are not in any way worried about the resurrection and the hereafter, at least act with dignity in this life. And look at your family backgrounds, because that's something they were very proud about. Look at your family backgrounds if you regard yourselves to be truly Arabs, as you claim. Because of course they were making great claims about their own lineages of nobility. And he was saying, well, if you are who you claim you are, then act with some shred of nobility, not in this abased way. Shimr, the one who would assassinate him, murder him. Shimr calls out, "What do you mean, O Hussein?" And Imam Hussain al-Islam looks directly at Shimr and he says, "I am the one you are fighting. You have decided to kill me. The women have done nothing to you, have done nothing wrong. Prevent your offenders from attacking my family so long as I'm alive." Notice, the Imam al-Islam did not call those men as soldiers or even mercenaries. He called them offenders, as the criminals that they were. He identified them with the label that he chose for them. But look at the response of Shimr. And often, we see in the history of the Ahlulbayt, it is their enemies who actually speak the words of just how great the Ahlulbayt actually are. In the midst of that battle, Shimr turns around and says, "You do have this right, O son of Fatima." Now, calling him the son of Fatima is very powerful because it is clearly setting forth that he is the grandson of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. Fatima being the sole surviving offspring of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the son of the daughter of the Holy Prophet, is the one they were fighting. And Shimr made that clear through his own admission. He says, "You do have this right, O son of Fatima." And then he turns to his group and he says, stop rushing towards the encampment of this man. Attack him. And then the key words come out. For indeed he is a noble warrior. It's remarkable. The nobility of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is being admitted by Shimr himself. This was the power of the rhetoric, of the eloquence, of the akhlaq of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. This was the flourishing of the Imam on the day, such that even Shimr had to acknowledge the greatness of the Imam's nobility. And it lays a precedent of chivalry for generations to come. It sets a foundation for how the Mahdi Ajjala Faraj salawatullahi alayhi will come and establish truth upon this earth. And when we reflect upon the teachings around the Messiah, the Mahdi, we see the extent to which he will reflect the teachings and the mannerisms of his illustrious great-grandfather, Abu Abdullah Hussain salawatullahi alayhi. We turn to the last set of discussions of the history of Imam Hussain alayhi salam in Karbala, and the mental health lessons of flourishing. It seems appropriate that we conclude our series by looking at the last will and testament of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. For what greater document can there be for us to learn about the values, the mission of Imam Hussain alayhi salam? It is recounted in the texts of history that he wrote his final will at the time of leaving Medina for Mecca, and he put his seal on it and gave it to his stepbrother Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. So as he was departing Medina and embarking upon his historic journey, he writes a will. Now, firstly, what's remarkable about it is that in the Arabic, it's only about 5 lines long. It's only about 5 lines of Arabic. And if you compare that to our lives and the wills that we write lengthy wills, even though what we are leaving behind is very little compared to what Imam Hussain alayhi salam was leaving behind. But this was the eloquence and the power of his words. For what he wrote continues to resonate till today and continues to be a gift for the believers. He begins, of course, at the beginning of the Holy Quran. He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, invoking the compassion and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the most compassionate, the most merciful. He says, this is what Al-Hussein ibn Ali has commended to his brother Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, that Hussein bears witness that there is no Lord but Allah, who is unique, with no partner, and that Muhammad is his servant and messenger, rightly came from his side, and that paradise is a fact, and hell is a fact, and that the hour of judgment will come. There is no doubt thereof. And because Allah shall raise those who are in the graves. So he's citing the resurrection. And indeed, I have not revolted boisterously. This was critical, because of course he knew that the narrative that would be spun would be that Yazid is trying to overcome a rebel. In fact, when the family of the Holy Prophet was taken from Karbala to Kufa, in the bazaars, the people were told, oh, the people who are coming are rebels. Imam Hussain alayhi salam dealt with that at the outset. He said, in his will, I have not revolted boisterously, insolently, corruptingly, or oppressively. Rather, so he put his defense in writing as he sets out from Medina. He says, rather, I have risen up seeking to rectify the affairs of the ummah of my grandfather. The phrase that we have been looking at each time we meet. Islah fi ummati jaddi. These are the words from his will, no less. the transformation, the reform of the community of his grandfather. That's what he has risen up for, not in any form of rebelliousness or any form of corruption, fitna, as they used to say. He says, I intend to call for the good and to prohibit committing the undesirable. Of course, Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. These words are in his will. So he made clear that he was fighting for Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar because both aspects had become lost in that community. There was no enjoining towards the good or warning about the evil. In fact, the evil was what was practiced by Yazid. And he says that he's taken the stand to act in accordance with the conduct of my grandfather and my father, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Hence, anybody who accepts this from me, they have already accepted the cause of Allah. This is important because, of course, regularly as he left Medina, as he entered Mecca and in Karbala, he kept citing verses from the Holy Quran, showing how his mission was the same as the great prophets, Musa, for example, Ibrahim, for example. Such that if you follow Hussain alayhi salam, as he says in his will, you have already accepted the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, all those people arrayed against him on the day of Ashura were actually fighting against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mission. He says, and if nobody answers me in this regard, I shall remain steadfast until Allah judges between me and the people. Now that's remarkable. So he's saying it doesn't matter to him whether people join him or don't join him. He will remain steadfast. And that's powerful for us when we formulate visions for our lives that inspire us. He says, for he is the best of all judges. And this is my last will and testament to you, my brother. And my success is from Allah alone. In him I have placed my trust, and to him I turn. He's citing, of course, Surah Al-Hud, Surah 11, verse 88. He's concluding his will with these famous words, وَمَا تَوْفِيقِ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ, that my success is only from Allah. عَلَيْهِ تَوَكَّلْتُ, I have placed my trust in him. وَإِلَيْهِ أُنِيبُ, and to him I turn. What a remarkable will to have, and what a remarkable set of teachings to leave to us. We grieve at the great cost that it has taken for us to receive these teachings. On the late afternoon of Ashura, as Imam Hussain alayhi salam comes to bid his final farewell to Imam Sajjad, he shakes him from the deep fever he was in and the unconscious state. Imam Sajjad looks up and he sees his beloved father covered in blood, preparing for battle. He says, Aina Habib, where is Habib? Imam Hussain weeps and says, Qad Qutil. He says, Aina Abbas, where is Hazrat Abbas? Imam Hussain says, Qad Qutil. Imam Sajjad asks about all the family members. Imam responds likewise, saying, Qad Qutil. He says, oh my beloved son, know that apart from you and me, there are no men left in this camp. They have all been martyred. I leave to you a special wasiyah. Convey my salams to my Shias. Tell them that their Hussein died for truth and justice. Tell them to remember me whenever they drink water, for their Hussein died hungry and thirsty for 3 days. As the Imam alayhi salam moves out after bidding farewell to the ladies, he mounts his horse, but the horse doesn't move. He says to his beloved horse, Zuljana, I know I've troubled you all day to carry bodies back, but this is the last time I will trouble you. But Zuljana was not fatigued. He signals to his feet, where the Imam looks down, he sees his beloved daughter Sakina holding on to the leg of the horse. This 4-year-old child crying, do not take my father to the battlefield. Imam Hussain alayhi salam comes off the horse and he asks this beloved daughter, have I not bid farewell to you? She says, yes, but answer me this. Throughout my life, I have always slept on your chest. How will I sleep
after you go. The son of Fatima lies on the burning sands of Karbala as his beloved daughter lays her head for the last time upon his chest. Suddenly she awakes saying, "Fi amanillah, my father, you're free to go." He asks, "Why, my child?" She says, "Because my grandfather Rasulullah had come to me in a vision saying, 'Do not delay Hussein for his final mission.'" Imam Hussain alayhi salam goes to his final battle and he hears the verses from Jibreel, "Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutmainnah irji ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiyah." Return back to your Lord, oh the most pleased soul at peace. The Imam alayhi salam descends from his horse. I cannot narrate to you what happens next with by the dagger of Shimmer, but know this, Jibreel calls from the skies, "Qad qutil al-Hussain bi Karbala." Bibi Zaynab alayhi salam from Tilla Zainabiyya sees the head of Imam Hussain lifted on a spear. Ala la'natullahi ala dhalimeen wa siya'lamu alladhina dhalamu ayya munqalibin yanqalibun. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Surah Mubarakat al-Fatiha.
There are roughly 153 million orphans worldwide. Every day, an estimated 5,700 more children become orphans. Alone, scared, and vulnerable. It's up to us to reach out to orphan children and show we care. Sponsor an orphan and give a child the